53 years before the birth of Christ, on a plain near a small town called Carrhae, 40,000 of the finest heavy infantry the world had ever produced stood in the open desert and waited to die. They didn't know that yet. They still believed what every Roman had believed for 200 years, that no army on earth could stand against the legion in open battle. They were about to learn that somewhere east of the Euphrates, an entirely different kind of war had been invented, one built not on the sword, but on the horse and the bow. One that didn't care how brave you were, or how disciplined, or how many years you drilled, because it never let you close enough to use any of it. This is the story of the two greatest military systems of the ancient world, the Roman legion and the armies of Persia, first under the Parthians and later the Sassanids, and the 400-year rivalry between them that neither side ever definitively won. So, who actually was stronger? Stick around, because the answer is more interesting than either side would have admitted.
To understand why this rivalry lasted so long, you have to understand that Rome and Persia weren't just two armies. They were two completely different theories about how to win a war. Rome grew up fighting in the hills and river valleys of Italy, then the forests of Gaul, then the mountains of Iberia. Close, cramped terrain where infantry that could hold a line and grind forward was worth more than anything else. So Rome built the most sophisticated heavy infantry system in the ancient world, disciplined, standardized, endlessly drilled, capable of building a fortified camp every single night on the march. Persia grew up somewhere else entirely, on the open steppe and plateau of Iran, where the horizon goes on forever and the horse has been the ultimate weapon since before recorded history. From the days of Cyrus the Great, Persian warfare was built around cavalry and archery, not the shield wall. Put simply, Rome perfected the infantryman, Persia perfected the horseman, and for 4 centuries, the border between their empires ran straight through the one kind of terrain, the flat, open plains of Syria and Mesopotamia, where each side's advantage was strongest. That's not a coincidence. That border is why this rivalry never really ended. Neither system could fully defeat the other on the ground where it mattered most.
Let's meet our first contender properly. By the late Republic, after the reforms traditionally credited to the general Gaius Marius around 107 BC, the Roman legion had become something the ancient world hadn't seen before: a professional, standing, salaried army open to any citizen, not just landowners, and equipped, trained, and supplied by the state itself. A legion numbered somewhere around 5,000 to 6,000 men, organized into 10 cohorts, each cohort built from 6 centuries of roughly 80 soldiers apiece. Every legionary carried the same core kit: a gladius for brutal close-range stabbing, a scutum, a curved rectangular shield built from layered wood and leather, heavy enough to stop an arrow, and the pilum, a throwing spear engineered with a soft iron shank that bent on impact so it couldn't be thrown back, and if it struck a shield, dragged uselessly on the ground and forced the enemy to drop his only protection. This wasn't a mob of warriors looking for individual glory. It was a machine. Legionaries trained constantly, with wooden weapons deliberately made twice the weight of the real thing, so battle would feel almost easy by comparison. They marched in formation, fought in formation, and even built a fortified camp, complete with a ditch and palisade at the end of every single day's march, win, lose, rain, or shine. Its signature strength was the ability to close distance and grind an enemy down at close range, where discipline mattered more than individual heroics, and to absorb losses that would shatter almost any other ancient army, because Rome's manpower reserves and logistics let it rebuild and march again. And behind the soldier was something almost as important as the sword: the road. Roman logistics, supply trains, engineered roads, fortified waypoints, let legions operate far from home for years at a time. This was an army built for grinding, sustained, close-quarters campaigns of conquest. But, and this is the detail that's going to matter a lot in about 15 minutes, the legion's entire design assumed the enemy would eventually have to come close enough to fight it. In the deserts east of the Euphrates, Rome was about to meet an enemy who had absolutely no intention of doing that.
When people say the Persian army in this rivalry, they're really talking about two different empires across 4 centuries. First, the Parthians, an Iranian dynasty that inherited the old Persian heartland after the fall of the Seleucid Greeks, and later the Sassanids, who overthrew the Parthians in 224 AD and built an even more centralized, more Persian-identified state, one that saw itself as the direct heir of Cyrus and Darius. But the military DNA underneath both empires was strikingly similar, and it was built on a completely different foundation than Rome's, almost no heavy infantry at all. Instead, horses, 2 kinds of them. The first was the horse archer, lightly armored, riding a fast, hardy step-bred horse, armed with a recurved composite bow that could outrange a thrown Roman javelin by a wide margin, and trained from childhood, literally from childhood, since Persian and Iranian noble culture raised boys in the saddle, to shoot accurately at a full gallop from any angle, including backward over the horse's rear while retreating. That maneuver became so famous, the Greeks and Romans gave it a name, the Parthian shot, the origin, actually, of the modern English phrase, parting shot.
The second was the cataphract, the shot cavalry of the Persian nobility. A cataphract and his horse were both covered, head to hoof, in overlapping iron or bronze scale armor. He carried a kontos, a lance up to 12 feet long, braced two-handed, capable, according to ancient accounts, of driving clean through more than one man at once. Only wealthy noble households could afford to field a cataphract. The armor, the horses, the retinue of grooms and spare mounts represented something close to an aristocratic estate's worth of investment. That expense bought Persia a weapon no other Mediterranean power could reliably field at scale. True heavy shot cavalry, generations before medieval European knights would reinvent the same idea. The doctrine that tied these two forces together was simple and devastating against the wrong opponent. Horse archers wear the enemy down from a distance he can't reach back across, and cataphracts deliver the killing blow once his formation is exhausted, disordered, or foolish enough to break ranks. The archers were the hammer that never stopped falling. The cataphracts were the point that finished the job. There was a catch, though, and it's one Rome would eventually learn to exploit. This entire system depended on open, flat terrain, a hot, dry climate that kept bowstrings taut, and critically, an endless supply of arrows. Take away any one of those 3 things, and the Persian war machine lost much of its bite. In 53 BC, none of those 3 things were missing, and Rome was about to find that out the hard way.
Before we get to the battles, let's do the head-to-head comparison properly, because who had better gear isn't actually a simple question. It depends entirely on the fight you're asking about. Range, no contest. The Parthian composite bow could kill at well over 100 yards. The pilum was a close-range weapon, effective at maybe 15 to 20 yards. In an open field with room to maneuver, Rome simply could not force a fight on its own terms. Armor. Roman legionaries wore larica hamata, mail, or later the segmented larica segmentata, good protection against slashing and moderate against thrusting, but not designed to stop a heavy arrow at close range or a lance strike from a galloping horse. Cataphracts, by contrast, wore some of the heaviest personal armor in the ancient world on both rider and horse. But that armor was staggeringly expensive, exhausting to fight in for long, and useless without the wealth of a noble estate behind it, which is exactly why Persia could never field cataphracts in legion-sized numbers. Melee, up close. Here, the legionary had the edge. The gladius, in a tight formation, in a genuine close-quarters brawl, was a brutally efficient killing tool, and legion discipline held up under pressure better than almost anything else in the ancient world. The problem, as we're about to see, was getting there.
Mobility and logistics. Persian cavalry could cover ground, retreat, regroup, and re-engage far faster than infantry could ever react. But that speed came at a cost. Sustaining a horse archer army required enormous numbers of remounts, and, as we'll see, literal camel trains of spare arrows. Rome's infantry was slower, but its logistics, roads, fortified camps, supply chains, let it operate for years in any terrain without that dependency. So here's the uncomfortable truth neither side liked to admit. This wasn't really who has the better army, it was who gets to fight on their own terrain. And for the first 2.5 centuries of this rivalry, that question got answered in the worst possible way for Rome, on a plain outside a small town called Carrhae.
53 BC, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome,
a member of the so-called First Triumvirate alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, wanted a war of his own. Caesar had Gaul. Pompey had the East already conquered once. Crassus wanted Parthia. He marched roughly 7 legions, somewhere around 35 to 40,000 infantry, plus a few thousand cavalry, deep into Parthian Mesopotamia, expecting the kind of campaign Rome always won: close with the enemy, break his line, take his cities. What met him instead was a Parthian force of perhaps 10,000 cavalry under a nobleman named Serena, outnumbered roughly 4 to 1, and made up entirely of horsemen, no infantry at all. At first, from a distance, the Parthian force didn't even look dangerous. Serena had ordered his cataphracts to cover their armor in cloth. Then, as the two armies came into full view of each other, the cloths dropped at once, steel flashing in the sun, and hollow drums covered in bells began to pound out a deep, rolling, deliberately terrifying roar.
Crassus formed his legions into a deep defensive square, expecting a cavalry charge he could absorb and counter. It never came. Instead, the horse archers spread out around the entire Roman formation and simply started shooting from a range the legionaries' javelins couldn't reach. The Romans locked shields overhead into the famous testudo, the tortoise. It worked in the sense that it stopped a lot of arrows. It also meant an entire Roman army was now standing still, blind, unable to maneuver, essentially waiting to be killed at Serena's convenience, because Serena had planned for exactly this. He'd brought a baggage train of 1,000 camels loaded with spare arrows, so his archers never ran dry the way the Romans were counting on. Desperate to break the stalemate, Crassus sent his son Publius, a talented young cavalry officer who'd served with distinction under Caesar and Gaul, out with roughly 6,000 men to drive the horse archers off. It worked for a moment. The Parthians turned and fled. Publius, elated, gave chase. It was a trap. The fleeing horse archers led Publius's detachment deep into open ground, out of sight of his father's main force, and then turned around. The Cataphracts, who had been waiting, charged. Plutarch describes Publius's cavalry, light Gallic horsemen with small spears, trying to fight men encased in steel on armored horses and simply being run through. Publius's force was annihilated. His head was mounted on a spear and paraded in front of his father's army to break Roman morale, and it worked.
The battle ground on until nightfall. When it was over, something close to 20,000 Romans were dead, another 10,000 captured, and perhaps only a fifth of Crassus's original army made it back to Roman Syria. Crassus himself, during a parley that was almost certainly a trap from the start, was killed, and according to later, admittedly hostile Parthian sources, mocked in death for his greed. Several Roman legionary eagle standards, the single greatest source of a legion's honor, were captured, a humiliation Rome would spend the next 30 years trying to erase. Carrhae is, to this day, considered one of the most complete tactical defeats Rome ever suffered, comparable to Cannae against Hannibal 2 centuries earlier. And the lesson was brutally simple. On open, flat terrain, with room to maneuver and enough arrows to keep firing, a mobile horse archer and cataphract army could dismantle the finest heavy infantry the ancient world had ever built, without ever letting it fight the battle it was designed for. So does that settle the question? Persia wins? Not quite. Because Rome learned from Carrhae, and the story of this rivalry has a second half that almost never makes it into the popular version.
Here's what Carrhae actually taught Rome. Not, we can't beat Persia, but we can't beat Persia on Persia's terrain with Persia's kind of battle. Over the next 3.5 centuries, Roman commanders adapted. They learned to campaign in winter, when damp air loosened Parthian bowstrings and made mounted archery far less effective. They learned to stick to river valleys and hill country where cavalry couldn't maneuver freely. They built up their own heavy and horse archer auxiliary units, recruited specifically to counter Persian tactics with Persian-style tools. And they leaned hard into what Rome always did best: sieges, engineering, and grinding campaigns that Persian cavalry, for all its speed, struggled to counter once Roman legions were dug in behind walls of their own making. The results were dramatic. In 115 AD, the Emperor Trajan didn't just invade Parthian territory, he marched all the way down the Tigris and captured Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital itself, before eventually withdrawing due to overstretched supply lines and revolts elsewhere in the empire, not because he was defeated in the field. Under the Emperor Lucius Verus and again under Septimius Severus, Roman armies sacked Ctesiphon not once, but multiple times over the following century.
And then there's a battle that deserves to be far more famous than it is, Satala, in 298 AD. By this point, Parthia had fallen and been replaced by the more aggressive Sassanid dynasty, and King Narseh had just handed Rome a serious defeat in open Mesopotamia. But the Roman commander Galerius chose his ground carefully, the rugged terrain of Armenia, mountainous and broken, exactly the kind of landscape that neutralizes cavalry and rewards disciplined infantry. Using local intelligence and the advantage of surprise, Galerius launched a devastating counterattack that shattered Narseh's army so completely that the Sassanid king's own wives, sisters, and children were captured in the field. The resulting Treaty of Nisibis handed Rome its most favorable eastern border in generations. In other words, same two military systems, same core weapons and tactics on both sides, but change the terrain, change the season, change the preparation, and the unbeatable side of the equation flips completely. It wasn't one-sided the other way either, of course. In 260 AD, the Sassanid king Shapur I inflicted one of the strangest humiliations in Roman history at the Battle of Edessa, actually capturing a reigning Roman emperor, Valerian, alive, the only time in Roman history that happened, and, according to hostile later tradition, using him as a literal human footstool until his death. And in 363 AD, the Emperor Julian died from a wound taken during a chaotic retreat from a failed invasion of Sassanid territory near Ctesiphon. So, across 400 years of this rivalry, the honest scorecard looks something like this: sweeping Roman defeats in open desert terrain when Persian cavalry had room to work and time to prepare, Carrhae, Edessa, and equally sweeping Roman victories when legions fought on ground that neutralized cavalry, brought sieges into play, or caught Persian forces overextended, Trajan's capture of Ctesiphon, Satala. Neither side ever permanently conquered the other's heartland. The border between Rome and Persia, give or take a province, sat roughly along the Euphrates for the better part of 7 centuries.
So let's finally answer the question in the title. If you're asking who wins a single-pitched battle on a flat open plain, with both sides at full strength and no terrain advantage, the honest answer, backed by Carrhae, is Persia. A horse archer and cataphract army fighting on ground built for cavalry with enough arrows and enough time could dismantle Roman heavy infantry almost every time, because it simply refused to let the legion fight the kind of battle it was designed to win. But if you widen the question to who wins the war, the siege, the campaign, the decade of grinding attrition, the fight for cities and supply lines and winter quarters, the advantage swings hard back toward Rome. No Persian army, Parthian or Sassanid, ever conquered and permanently held Roman territory the way Rome repeatedly captured and for a time held the Persian capital itself. Rome's engineering, logistics, and sheer capacity to absorb catastrophic losses and rebuild, the very things that looked so useless standing still under Parthian arrows at Carrhae, were exactly what let it come back again and again.
That's really the whole lesson of this 400-year rivalry, and maybe the most useful thing military history can teach you about who would win questions in general. There's no such thing as an objectively superior army, separate from the ground it's standing on, the season it's fighting in, and the war it's actually trying to win. The Roman legion was arguably the finest close-quarters fighting system the ancient world produced. The Parthian and Sassanid cavalry armies were arguably the finest mobile missile and shock system the ancient world produced. Put them on the wrong ground for either one, and you already know who wins before the first arrow flies. Rome and Persia fought each other, on and off, for roughly 700 years, longer than the United States has existed. And when it finally ended, it wasn't because either side beat the other. It was because a third force, one neither empire saw coming, swept out of the Arabian desert in the 7th century and toppled a Sassanid empire already exhausted from one final brutal round of wars with a Roman empire that had, by then, become Byzantine in every way but name. Two of the greatest military machines in human history spent 7 centuries proving neither one of them could quite finish the job. If you want to go deeper on any one piece of this story, Carrhae, the rise of the cataphract, or how a legion actually built a fortress camp overnight in enemy territory, let me know in the comments, because there's a full episode in each one of those. And if you enjoyed watching two of history's greatest armies refuse to lose for 700 years straight, hit subscribe, because this channel is just getting started.